So our first panel is actually a live podcast with the trade guys and Ambassador OLOFSDOTTER. But before they start, we'd like to share a few words with one of the trade guys. Welcome to the Executive Forum, Scott Miller.
It's a great pleasure to be here.
Well, great to have you here. This is so much fun. I just love your podcast, and I like the tone in your podcast. So I was curious, how did this idea come about? And because you clearly have a strategy how you put this together.
Well, well, first of all, thanks for listening. And as I always tell people, subscribe and like.
Yeah.
That's the podcast business.
Yeah.
But having said that, look, Bill Reinsch and I have worked together over the years here in Washington on trade policy. I used to be in the private sector. Bill was headed an association that the company I worked for belonged to. Mm-hmm. And so we had a fairly long and productive working relationship. We both wound up at CSIS, the foreign policy think tank. As candidate Donald Trump began campaigning, something dawned on us, which is that trade policy, which had been an important subject, but not one in the public forum, all of a sudden became front page news. So Bill and I, sort of toiled away for years on the back page of the business section, as it were. Yes. All of a sudden, front page above the fold are issues that are actually quite complicated and were new to the voter. Yeah. And so it was out of that, Bill and I, because of both of our experience with sort of public communication about a relatively obscure subject, thought we ought to do something to basically help voters know what's going on. And then through the additional genius of Andrew Schwartz, who's the head of external relations at CSIS, he came up with the notion of a branded product called the Trade Guys. And we were essentially, if you remember the Muppet Show, there were two guys in the balcony, Statler and Waldorf.
What the two of us, yeah.
We were sort of the Statler and Waldorf of the trade policy world. And the only insight we had was we had to speak in plain language. Yes. Trade people often are very knowledgeable, but we all talk in code. And so we have the WTO and we have GATT and 301 and all these literally code words, okay? And Bill and I made it a point to talk with the listener about trade issues in a way that everyone can understand. Yeah. And so really it was the president's, which I'm always grateful for the new lease on life of my career, because this has been one of the most entertaining things I've done in my adult life. But that was the story, and we're grateful to have all the subscribers and listeners that we do, and we hope to continue on this role.
Yeah. This is so complex matters, and you said trying to make it understandable for the average voter. But I also think when you really, the way you explain things, I'm sure there's lots of business people, including myself, that you finally, there's some pieces of the puzzle that kind of fits together. So I think that the language and the tone is just amazing. And I think that, we need more of this in many areas.
Well, thank you. It's one thing to talk about GATT Article 3. Yeah. It's another thing to say you shouldn't discriminate on the basis of the nationality of the product. Yeah. Okay, and the voter gets that, and they don't care about the other one, which is fine. That's where voters should be. So who are the trade guys? Well, Bill and I are officially the trade guys, and Bill has had a longer career in Washington than I have. He came here as a congressional staffer and worked on the Hill for about 20 years. Was then Undersecretary of Commerce in the Bureau of Industry and Security for 8 years during the Clinton administration. And then he headed the National Foreign Trade Council, which is a trade association of multinational companies here, and joined CSIS recently, or about 3 years ago. It seems longer ago than that. Yeah. But we're glad to have him. I spent my career at Procter & Gamble, half of it in the commercial side, 34 years total, but the last 17 in Washington doing global government relations. And so Bill and I crossed paths a number of times. We bring different experiences to the program, but have dealt with a lot of the same issues over that period. And so we're glad to be united at CSIS, and we're glad to be doing this show. So
and today you have an all-star team with the ambassador joining as well.
She's been a guest before on the podcast.
Oh, I didn't know that.
One of our favorite guests, and so we're delighted to have a return engagement.
What are you going to cover in today's episode?
Well, the three topics we think are most top of mind for listeners are, first, we want to talk about sort of trade in the 2020 elections and what the politics of American trade look like these days, at least from our points of view. Second, I think it's important to talk about the COVID pandemic and the effect that has had both on aggregate demand, which industries are changing and how, and what that might mean for trade. And then I think we want to talk about U.S.-China relations in the context of Swedish companies operated in the United States. So those, generally speaking, I think are three rich topics. We'll try to get into them and do our best to do them justice.
Okay, Scott, thank you so much for the pre-briefing. I'll let you go and join the guys and
thanks for the invitation. And thanks for letting us come doing this. This is a lot of fun.
And let's roll.
The first time I heard our music in a long time was when Bill and I did an event in Dallas, Texas, for the retail, the big box store people, the retail industry leaders, and the music with which we walked on the stage was the Trade Guys theme, and we thank Andrew Schwartz for it. He's the musician in the group and picked it out.
And really the last event, that was the end of February. So it was right before everything stopped.
Last air travel.
Rock star music, and you guys are rock stars on trade, so it's very fitting.
I don't think we have the walk down.
No. No. We're
not Mick Jagger.
We'll do our best.
Well, you're the Mick Jaggers of trade.
Well, thank you.
Well,
we'll use that in a commercial.
Thanks for being with us again, Ambassador. It's a great pleasure to be at the House of Sweden. It's a wonderful facility, and you know, with COVID, this is kind of like our day out. So it's kind of an unusual break, when we're delighted to be here in person and having this conversation. So maybe we kick it off and talk about politics for a little bit. I mean, that's on everybody's mind. Well, I guess you could call it a debate. It was the TV guide listed it as a debate, but that happened earlier this week.
We can't call it on this kind of forum what the commentators are calling it.
Yes, yes. But obviously, we're about, I think, 34 days till Election Day today, 33, 34, somewhere around in there. And the race is very tight, as it usually is at this point in the American presidential election. So I think as a topic, it's a good place to start. And the campaigns are, in some ways, talking about similar things and themes about America first and make it in America. So, Bill, you've looked at this very closely from the standpoint of what candidates have been saying all along.
Yeah, elections don't bring out the best in anybody, really. Right. And we saw that Tuesday night. And trade is an issue that's easy to oversimplify. If you look at polling data in this country, there's a lot of, I guess what you could say, the cognitive dissonance. Most Americans are pro-trade, and they say they're pro-trade, 70% or so. But if you ask them other questions, like does trade cost jobs, they'll say yes. Is our companies moving offshore good? And they'll say no. So they seem to be able to hold opinions that are not entirely the same simultaneously. Elections tend to play on the downside. The president, in particular, has made trade a signature issue for him. It usually has not been a big issue in our election. If you do other kinds of poll data, and don't ask people what they think about trade, but ask them what's important, trade is 7 out of 8, or actually this year it's 8 out of 8. Climate change has moved up a notch. What they really say is important are the economy, healthcare, and terrorism, which have consistently been at the top 3 of things that Americans are worried about for more than 10 years. So trade is hovering down at the bottom. The president has made it the big deal. He has a policy of victimization, is the best way to put it. The United States has been taken advantage of by the evil foreigners. We'll exclude Sweden from that category for today's purposes. But you know, we've been taken advantage of by the foreigners. It's their fault for cheating and breaking the rules, and it's all of his predecessors' fault for not doing anything about it. And his message to the American people in 2016 was, I'm going to fix it. So the campaign comes around to 2020. What does he say? I'm great, I'm fixing it. And his opponent is saying, no, you're not. you know, the trade deficit is bigger. It's gone up. This year may be an exception because of COVID, but every year has been bigger than it was in 2016. That you haven't solved any of the problems that you're talking about. You don't have a plan. You have scattershot tariffs, and you haven't built coalitions. You haven't worked together, particularly with Europe, to address common problems like China. And they'll continue to beat each other over the head on that. What I think will happen is that the trade debate is going to become fairly quickly a debate about China. And both candidates are accusing the other of being soft on China. American public opinion has turned very negative about China over the last several years. I think largely because of Chinese policies. It's not because of Trump. But both candidates say the other is failing to address the problem properly. And they'll spend the campaign attacking each other.
Yes, now, despite all the sound and fury, the American market is still relatively open to trade and a great place to invest. So if you look, despite the 4 years of President Trump and some selective tariffs on China and on aluminum and steel and a lot of mischief in general, which has kept us in business, thankfully. But if you look overall, the U.S. MFN bound tariff is between 3 and 4% on average. Applied tariffs are even lower, so I think it's applied tariffs around 2% on for the average good imported, and so tariffs are relatively low. The market is open and contestable in almost every respect, and it's a wonderful place to invest. I mean, investors are well protected. It's a great consumer market. So with all the criticisms that abound from the politicians, the United States is still deeply engaged with the world and a great place for Swedish companies or anybody else to make their fortune. So.
No, I agree with you. I mean, this is a great place to invest. I think what companies need and want, and we all want, is predictability.
Sure.
So I think the debate is worrying for a country like Sweden because, you know, we're 10 million people, highly competitive country with fantastic companies. We're the 13th largest investor in the United States. Mm-hmm. So we're big, and we're not exactly population-wise the 13th largest country in the world. So we have great companies, and you know, we create 365,000 jobs here. But what companies need to know, and what we need to do, is that we will continue to do that. Mm-hmm. This from both sides, I would say, protectionist rhetoric is not helpful. And also we believe that there's no turning back. All our companies are dependent on global value chains, so are American companies. And if we want to, if companies are going to invest more here, we need to know that we can rely on those global value chains. Yes. And you know, because this is a fantastic market. And of course, the United States has the luxury of basically being a continent. Sweden is not a continent. Right. Okay, we are part of the European Union, which is comparable, of course, to the United States. But we really think that it's important that the United States and the European Union work together because we are each other's biggest markets. And if China is what we're worried about, if we join forces, for instance, on standards, etc., that's how we also get them in line. Simplified, of course. There are so many more issues to it, but predictability is what we need, and possibilities, like you say, it's still an open country. The political rhetoric is not the same, but. Right.
Well, we have a president who doesn't believe in predictability. He thinks it gives him more leverage if people don't know what's going to happen next, which is exactly the wrong signal for business, but it's something that he believes in. I think President Biden would pursue some of the same policies, frankly, but I think the tone would be different and the level of certainty would be different. You make a very good point about working together with Europe. The Democrats have faulted this administration for not trying to do that. I have to say it's difficult because there's a number of areas where we have sharply different views and some ongoing disputes that have turned out to be very difficult to resolve. Boeing, Airbus being the most obvious, very specific one. But Europe is taking a lot of steps in directions that are troubling for us. The digital service tax proposal, the Digital Service Act that you're considering, the EU's policy on antitrust and competition is not only different from ours, but increasingly different from ours. and appears, in our view, to be aimed really at large American companies. So I think it's getting more difficult rather than easier. The good news is that you're probably going to escape that in the election, because the election will be focused on China. You know, China is going to be the bad guy. Europe is not going to be the bad guy. But the fact is, we've got a boatload of bilateral problems,
Exactly.
and you've got the Commission saying at various levels that probably it's not the right time to move forward on a broader trade agreement.
No, and remember how we were actually not that far away. I mean, we were far away, but we had gotten quite far anyway with the TTIP discussions, and I was part of that in Brussels at the time. And of course, I know, and we all know, it's extremely hard to get those huge, big trade agreements across the finishing line, because there are so many other factors that weigh in at the end. But I think we had a lot of elements in that agreement which we had worked on and solved. So I think it's very important that going forward that we look into what do we have, what's positive, what can we solve. And I mean, I'm not saying that the European Union is perfect in any way. Just like you say, this is things that are worrying for you on the other side of the Atlantic. And in Sweden, we are, one of the biggest proponents of free trade within the Union. But we are feeling a bit that we are having an uphill battle.
How do we get Sweden to have more influence?
Well, yeah, exactly. Maybe we should grow our population by I don't know how many millions.
Well, one thing that you may consider is a stock taking, because look, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership was launched 10 years ago. Okay, so it's been a decade, a lot of polite information sharing, not much progress.
Yes.
Oddly, while President Trump came into office and gleefully fulfilled a campaign promise of killing the Trans-Pacific Partnership in its crib, and was happy about that, nobody ever talked about TTIP. In fact, it's still an operating project for practical purposes within both the United States and Europe. So for some reason, we're not getting anywhere. And this may be a good time to say, where do we really need to get somewhere?
Yeah.
And I understand
really
we get stuck
agree.
on old issues like agriculture and new issues like technology, but there are some issues where if we were playing as a team, it would be better for the world and better for the challenge that, say, China presents.
Yes, and then together we are, 850 million people. And I do agree with you. We should look into what we have, what can we go forward with. Agriculture is a non-starter. Public procurement on this side is probably a non-starter.
Don't get Bill started on chicken. That's all I can say.
I was just going to say, is this my chance to talk about chickens?
Now, we talked about earlier the chicken nuggets
Yes, that's right.
and COVID. But no, but I really agree with you. And this is very important that we send this message that we must cooperate.
Yes.
Because we see the same challenges, for instance, when it comes to China and other actors. But if we do agree, and this sounds so simplified because, of course, it's not in reality. These are very technical issues, but we really must work together. And so these tariffs that have come out on national security reasons on steel and aluminum, not helpful. Other things like that. We could clean the table when it comes to Airbus and Boeing, and that has been suggested from the EU side. So I think there are things we can do.
Well, that may move now that the Europeans have their number, the amount they can retaliate. I think that the U.S. view on that was that their number was going to be a lot smaller than ours. It turned out to be about half ours, a little more than half ours. I think that will probably lead to a negotiation. The problem will be, frankly, that there's a different. I think they have to first agree on what they're going to negotiate. I think the EU view is going to be, well, we got caught, and we promised not to do it anymore. And this time we mean it, as opposed to the last 4 times when we didn't mean it. I think the American view is going to be, well, that's all very well and good, but you have to pay. You've sinned and you have to pay for your sins. And
well, now there's an offset, though, because there was a finding against the U.S.
We're all sinners.
And so everyone's a sinner.
My experience negotiating is if it ends up being about a number, we say you owe us 10 billion and you say you owe us nothing. There's probably some number in the middle that we can agree
5.
on. Maybe not 5, but some number that we can agree on.
We can get there.
When you start talking about rules and standards, then it gets very complicated. Numbers are easy, so we may be able to get there.
No, and I think we can cooperate on the WTO. I know it's been difficult here, and we have also concerns about a lot of the multilateral organizations that we need to reform them. But it's when the United States decides that we should reform them that we will actually get it going.
Now that will be a change. If Biden wins, I mean, to me the biggest difference between the two candidates in this area is Trump is a dyed-in-the-wool unilateralist.
Yes.
He believes in the unilateral exercise of American power. He doesn't believe in teams. He doesn't believe in coalitions. He doesn't believe in multilateral agreements. He likes bilateral agreements. Biden is exactly the opposite. His whole life has been focused on multilateralism, working within institutions, working with coalitions. One of his criticisms, actually all the Democratic candidates' criticisms of this administration was they don't build coalitions. They don't work with others. And as Scott said, we have a common competitive challenge in China. And we will have a bigger, in a way, a bigger one with India down the road.
Yes.
There's a lot of reasons why we should be working together.
Now, when we do decide to work together, it will be in a very different world than we were in 10 months ago or 9 months ago. The pandemic has changed a lot of things. It's changed a lot of the way we work. The estimate was about 5% of Americans worked from home before the pandemic. The peak during the pandemic was 46%. But the researchers at Stanford University predict that the going rate post-pandemic will be 20%. So we're not going to reset down. We've accelerated adoption of certain technologies. We have strained every possible supply chain because of the rapid changes in demand. We're just getting through this, but I'm a believer that our economy will look different, and we'll have to behave differently about how we set priorities.
And we're shortening supply chains. Can maybe say a few words about that.
Well, that's one of the
started
things.
before COVID, but it's accelerated.
There's a fascinating trend, and the trend is away from sort of long-haul globalization. Assemble it in a distant market, which is basically a labor cost arbitrage play, and more toward regional supply chains, mostly because of the success of globalization. Globalization succeeded by creating customers everywhere. So now there's a very large middle class in what we used to characterize as producing markets, say in Southeast Asia. There are consumers there as well. And so what we're finding is more supply chains are regional rather than global in nature. There's sort of factory North America, which is the NAFTA or USMCA countries. There's factory Europe, which is the EU plus the partnership agreements that wind up making things together and selling things to each other. Okay, and the same thing is emerging now in Asia because of the increasing size of the millennial consumer markets that are available in India and China and elsewhere. So the supply chains are regionalizing. That's a change we're going to have to cope with. It's probably a good one. Companies want to be more responsive to the final consumer demand. Being close to the consumer helps that. But also, as labor costs go up in a place like China, it's easier to change the calculation and find other ways to operate your chains. So
I agree with you. I really think this will probably lead to a change, and maybe 3D printing will really come out.
Yes.
And
new
technologies.
Yes.
And also it could also be good for climate, because of course all the transportation of goods is harmful. But it's important that we don't cut those global value chains off. We still keep them, because there's no way that we can produce things that people can afford, actually.
Yeah, autarky makes things worse. It makes things much more expensive. And so if you want to make everything in America, it's theoretically possible, but I think there would be major resistance on the part of both consumers and producers because of the cost associated with such a move. We work with Fred Smith, the CEO of FedEx Express, a creator of the company. And he always points out the average American family of 4 saves over $1,000 a year because of global trade, because of these value chains, and that adds value to their life. It's income that their spending power is magnified because of it. And nobody wants to give that back, nor should they, because it's best that we cooperate and work on making things together.
There's one of the things that intrigued me the other day, I was looking at surveys, and it turns out that Sweden is one of the top 10 innovative countries, which I didn't know.
We're top 5 basically everything.
Well, this particular survey was partly based on size. So because the big ones were China, in Europe, Germany, and France. But the bottom line is, as far as technological development and innovation, you're playing above your size.
Absolutely.
Which at the same time, I think one of the things to worry about for Swedish businessmen to worry about is what Scott referred to, which is one of the themes of this election is going to be Buy American. And at one level, it's about federal procurement, which, I mean, the EU gets very excited about government procurement here, but the reality is it's not a big part of our economy. At the federal level, 96% of our procurement is already domestic anyway, and of the remaining 4%, half of that is offshore purchases for offshore use, like our embassy in Stockholm. You know, they don't go to Safeway to buy their food. They go to, you know, hopefully, right, it's local. But the debate is expanding to talk about reshoring. And both candidates are saying it's time for American companies to come home, to come back. Scott's talked about why that's a mistake, but it's a challenge, I think, for foreign companies.
Absolutely, it really is. Okay, we already have a lot of companies invested in the United States, and as we've talked about earlier, this is this is the market. So you want to have presence here, you want to produce here, you want to sell to the American public. But of course, given that we act on a global scale, the Swedish companies cannot just, you know, move here and forget everything else. It is interlinked. So. Of course, we are also looking for investments in our country to, you know, outgrow our economy, and we are as open as we can be to attract companies to Sweden. So, for instance, we have lots of American investments in Sweden, which of course benefit from our workforce and, as you said, our innovative power and so on. So, I really hope that this will not go too far.
Well, look, reshoring is a popular theme for the politicians. Yes. But when you look at it in the context of the COVID crisis, they're actually solving the wrong problem. The problems were demand-side problems. Panic buying of medical equipment, instant demand where it wasn't there the week before. They weren't per se supply problems. Okay, the supply chain had to figure out how to adapt, but many of these problems were created by policies on the demand side, and as soon as demand returns to something like normal, they're going to go away, and reshoring won't be a solution to any particular problem.
No, and for instance, what we saw in healthcare, Minister Hallberg that we just saw, she has launched a program called Trade for Health, where we should really reduce the barriers for health-related products, medicines, and so on, to really, you know, be able to stock ourselves up fairly quickly, because we need to do some stockpiling. Probably that's what will come out of this, but we also need to be able to quickly.
You need a system that's resilient, but you've got to start with the fact that nobody makes everything. In fact, a lot of countries don't make anything. So in this sector, so it's, you've got to manage it carefully and make sure you're addressing the genuine needs.
But the problem here is that this is all framed in the context of national security.
Yes.
We have to make it here because it's critical to our security to have it here, and the definition of what is national security is becoming very elastic. It gets bigger and bigger and bigger. My favorite story was when a Chinese company, Shuangwei, bought Smithfield, the pork company. We had senators arguing basically that bacon was a national security item and needed to be protected. That didn't win. They didn't prevail. The company was sold. But you can see it's not very hard to say, well, food is national security. Personal protective equipment is national security. Pharmaceuticals are national security, and the universe of stuff you have to protect gets bigger and bigger and bigger, with all the consequences that Scott was talking about earlier.
But there are some genuine national security components in our relationship with China. We may want to go there just as we wrap up. I think that's an important dimension that faces both Europe and the innovative companies in Europe and countries in Europe, as well as the United States.
I think we need to look at China both as an opportunity, of course it is, and a challenge. So, for instance, we have to look at, in the European Union, we are looking at, market access and such things. At the same time, when it comes to challenges, we are all taking much more seriously investment screening and so on. So I think we have to do both, because, of course, the Chinese people and China is very important for all of us, and both when it comes to opportunities and challenges. So I think it's important we do both and not see everything as a national security issue, because then we will hurt ourselves.
Our friend Joyce Chang, who heads research at JP Morgan, calls it co-opetition. We're going to cooperate some places, and we compete other places.
I like that word, co-opetition. That's good.
All I can say is I offend all my European friends when I say this, and I'm about to offend the Swedish-American Chamber of Commerce.
This is Bill, not Scott. For those of you listening.
You guys are 2 or 3 years behind us in understanding China. It is a much bigger problem than you think, and it is more of an existential problem than you think.
But even more important that we cooperate then.
Well, yes. I think we come out in the same place, but we look at the country differently. And from my perspective, it's not because of something that's strange going on here, although there's plenty of strange things going on here. The Chinese government has been pursuing, has been moving backward in its policies. More state control, more state-owned enterprises. They haven't done enough about IP theft, but they're also engaging in human rights policies that pose real challenges for us with Hong Kong, with the Uyghurs. They're pursuing very aggressive actions in the South China Sea, claiming, space that is claimed by 7 or 8 other countries at the same time. It's a very aggressive position, and the United States is a Pacific power. We have a lot of stakes there that most European countries don't have. But the economic challenge is really big and getting bigger.
Well, we've tapped some rich veins here today, and I think what this calls for is another appearance by the ambassador and the trade guys. In fact, you'll become an honorary trade guy.
You called me the coolest ambassador in the Washington
which we
when
stand
I was
by.
Yes, because we had the coolest companies.
We definitely stand by that claim. But we thank you for being with us today.
No, thank you so much.
And thanks to the association for allowing us to be part of your program, and we welcome the opportunity to talk to you again.
Well, thank you so much for being here, and thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure.